Hi there. My name is Dr. Michael Vallis. I'm a health psychologist and I work in the area of diabetes and address the psychological aspects of living with diabetes. In this brief video, there are really two questions that I'd like to chat about. The first question is, what is diabetes burnout, diabetes distress, and what are the signs? And then the second is, what can you do to prevent or manage diabetes distress? And these are very important questions. So let me start with the first question. What is diabetes distress or diabetes burnout? The important point to make here is really a very basic observation. No one wants to have a disease. Therefore, there is a psychological burden associated with any chronic disease. Now imagine a disease that shows up every day, morning, noon, and night, doesn't take a vacation, doesn't take weekends. And it gives you the idea that the burden is actually there. And so it's very important that we recognize the burden so that it becomes really normalized. It's actually true that most people living with diabetes experience diabetes burnout and diabetes distress, but not all the time and not to extreme degrees. And so it's important that we understand where this comes from and how we can recognize it. In my work, I often ask people the following question. What words do you use to describe what it's like to live with diabetes? And would you be surprised to know that the words that I hear are burden, stressful, overwhelming, frightening, expensive. There are no positive words that I've ever heard anyone talk about when they talk about what it's like to live with diabetes. And so this is, I think, the first aspect, is to normalize that diabetes is a burdensome disease, and therefore the management piece becomes challenging. We've done a lot of work understanding the psychological experience of diabetes, and diabetes distress is one of the more important aspects of this work. I really like a very straightforward model that would help you to identify what are the signs of diabetes distress. The first is really a simple question. I'd like to ask people the following question. If diabetes was a weight that you were carrying in a backpack, how heavy would it be? Would it be a 1 pound loaf of bread, a 5 pound sack of potatoes, a 50 pound iron anvil, or a 2-ton truck? This is a simple question, and it can be understood very quickly what the individual's experience is like. Then as we understand that burden, then there are really 4 aspects of distress that I think are really helpful for really most people with diabetes. And we call those the emotional burden of living with diabetes, which is that sort of heavy, weighty type of experience. The second is what we call regimen distress. So any distress associated with the tasks of diabetes management, all of the work that's required. And then the other 2 aspects of diabetes distress involve relationships. First, relationships with family and friend, and second, relationships with healthcare providers. So you might just do a quick screening. How burdensome has my disease been in the last month, in the last 6 months, however you want to frame it. And then how am I doing with regard to just living with diabetes, the burden? How am I doing with managing all the tasks that I have to take on? And how am I navigating my relationships with healthcare providers and with family members? The important part of doing this awareness and screening is so that we can do something to manage.
Diabetes distress is a common and normal reaction to the ways that those of us with diabetes must constantly monitor and manage our condition. At times, it can feel like too much. When you're in the middle of diabetes distress, check in with yourself. Be realistic about what you can do during this time. As long as you're not in medical danger, it can be appropriate to ease up on rules to find some space to heal so that you can resume your more careful management. We can let go of that perfectionistic mindset and have compassion for the struggles we're having. Perfection isn't even possible, so give yourself a break. Treat yourself with kindness. This is not a time to bully yourself into doing better. It's a time to check in and nourish yourself as you would a dear friend. Acknowledge and name what you are feeling. Oh, there's frustration here, or I notice sadness coming up. The act of identifying and naming what we feel is a simple way to create some space and to remember that you are more than your diagnosis. Remember what is meaningful and important to you. Each person has unique pieces of life that matter, and those can serve as a compass when lost in an emotional storm. Use them as motivation to keep going, while also giving yourself permission to aim for small steps during this time.
What can I do to prevent or manage burnout and distress? And I'd like to encourage that there are many, many things that can be done that can be really helpful. But the first point to make to you is the following. We have a tendency in our society to downplay distress. So the common question, how are you doing? Oh, fine. Even if you're not doing fine. Have you ever noticed that? You might be struggling and someone says, how are you? You say, I'm fine. Why would you say that? Well, because we just tend to minimize the distress. Because the only language you really have to talk about is like being overly burdened. So we tend to pathologize distress and think about it in terms of a serious mental health disorder. Well, guess what? It isn't. Most psychological distress makes perfect sense. If you're going through a difficult time, you're going to be experiencing distress. The experience of loss produces the feeling of sadness. The experience of threat produces the feeling of anxiety. And the experience of unfairness produces the feeling of anger. And so depression, anxiety, anger are normal feelings. And so the first point to make really is to be open to exploring your feelings and not try to push them away or minimize them. And as you understand the journey of diabetes, I like to think about it psychologically as involving the following three factors. Number one, disease acceptance. To what extent have you come to terms with living with diabetes in a way in which you accept the disease, but you're not overburdened by it, that you're actively engaged in its management? And this varies depending on the state of the disease. Diagnosis is very different from once you become familiar with the disease, which can be very difficult. And so disease acceptance is, I think, a first psychological step. Second step is treatment acceptance. There's a lot of things that can be done to manage diabetes, but you have to actually do the work. And so it's that acceptance of the need for the treatments. This is a major issue in type 2 diabetes, where we have a phenomenon that we call inertia, where there is a tendency for individuals living with type 2 diabetes, as well as healthcare providers, to be slow in increasing treatments or going on insulins or taking injectables, because they sort of, just want to take it slow and easy. Whereas the treatment acceptance is very important in terms of getting the most. The challenge with diabetes is to prevent the complications. So that means that you have to change before you have the problem, which isn't so easy. And then the third psychological step is what we call readiness for self-management, which is once the disease and the treatment have been sort of framed up, here's where you are in the stage of your disease, here's the treatment we're recommending, then your readiness to follow through on those treatment plans. And I'd like to just normalize any challenges that you have and encourage you to be open with your healthcare providers around these psychological aspects of diabetes burnout, diabetes distress, so that you can really accomplish two things. One is what we call engagement, getting involved in your diabetes, really actively participating in the care. But you need to do this in the context of support. And this then takes what could be a burdensome disease and gives you the opportunity to live very well with diabetes. So thank you for the opportunity to talk briefly about the concept of diabetes burnout and diabetes distress and how we can manage it. Thank you very much.
If you are in crisis and having thoughts of suicide or self-harm, please call your local crisis line or 911. Reach out to your healthcare team and see what resources they have. Clinics often have nurses or educators who can help, and if they can't help directly, they can help you find a person who can. Finding a community of people with diabetes can also be really helpful in seeing how common distress is, and even having some cheerleading from people who know the struggle. If you don't have an in-person community, you can see if there's a group on Reddit or Facebook that you can join, or maybe there's a meetup group in your area. 2 online resources to check out are the Diabetes Canada site and Beyond Type 1. Beyond Type 1 has a specific mental health section, and the information there is applicable to all types of diabetes. Remember, it's normal to experience burnout and distress from managing diabetes. It's an act of strength and resilience to ask for the support that you need.